Okay. All the best.
Hi, I'm Vrinda Agarwal, and thank you so much for joining us on this edition of ICANN Facebook Live, Indian Economy in and Post COVID-19. ICANN, India COVID Action Network, is a unique initiative where you can help your community to fight COVID-19 by connecting those who are in need of help and those who can provide it. You can please check out your website for more details on how you can become a COVID warrior. And now coming back to our topic on Indian economy and how COVID-19 has impacted it. Truth is stranger than fiction, and our present reality is strange and hard to believe. We are all fighting and defending ourselves against an invisible enemy in the process, redefining our lives, livelihood, social interactions, money, commerce, and the list just goes on and on. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Shamika Ravi, a senior fellow at Brookings Institution and former member of Prime Minister's Advisory Council. Thank you so much, Dr. Ravi, for joining us. Uh, Before you delve into your presentation, I would actually start by asking you something more personal question. So, what is it that you found recently which has been very disruptive as well as positive for these crises? It can be a story, a statistic, something that you've been seeing globally around the world, anything that has come as disruptive or positive for you.
Well, it's entirely disrupted. Life as we know it has completely come to a standstill. I mean, just look at us. We are working from home. We are raising kids. We are full-time parenting. The kids are around all the time. Everyone wants to continue life the way they were leading before this crisis struck, right? That's very innate human nature. And yet we're all physically very constrained. So it's a peculiar situation, but it does throw up some good things. On a personal level, I'm very delighted to be able to spend so much time with my kids. I enjoy the garden outside. There are many, I mean, in Delhi, clear skies. You can see migratory birds. You can see stars, or, very clear skies. From a larger health perspective, Vrinda, I think, this might be that big exogenous shock that we needed in India to pivot our entire growth strategy towards healthcare. No country in history has grown without a robust healthcare system. We have been growing despite that for quite some time. And now that window is opening. So you also have to seize that opportunity. What can we do to build the health system beyond what we've had? So there are good things as well. Every crisis is also an opportunity and not to be wasted.
So I was reading your study on India 2024 policy priorities for the new government. And since you mentioned health and education were two top priorities, and then you moved on to training, foreign services, and several more came. And what struck me was health education. Third is gap between education and skill. And fourth, that I wanted to add a dimension today is like remote learning and internet accessibility in the rural areas. So I don't know, maybe if you want to start with your presentation, how would you like to go about it? But if you could talk about the health infrastructure within our economy,
Sure.
Is it crumbling? Has the government still trying to save itself from getting crumbled by acting faster? And on the maybe we should start with health and then I can move to education for you.
Sure. So first of all, Vrinda, productivity of a country, growth of a country very fundamentally rests on its human capital. It's impossible to grow a country on the back of unhealthy, illiterate population. And I think from that perspective, given how large we are, we've always had specific segments, pockets of excellence. So we have engines of growth, which are IT sector, which are pharma sector. You had pockets. But this is really a continent. We are such a large country, 1.38 billion, 28 robust state economies. It's important to realize that that underlying common factor, which is human capital, if it is not of a certain quality, sustained growth is not possible in the long term. So I think health and education so far in India, and I think it's really a legacy of, this feudal mindset and administrative sort of the massive juggernaut that we have often treated these sectors, we've clubbed them together as social sector. These are not sectors which typically people want to be posted in. These are typically departments and ministries with not too much budget. These are usually considered punishment posting. Most bureaucrats, well-performing, want to be in defense and finance, and that's a pity, because globally, again, you will see in the OECD market, some of the best, sort of richest economies today. In terms of governance, health and education and labor are very high up on the priority as far as governance is concerned. So really the best minds in these countries are working on labor policies, okay, education policies, health policies. So that's one thing. The second is, no country has seen a decline in health spending. As the world population ages and as cost of healthcare increases, which it will, global demand for healthcare will only increase. So I think also from a strategic point of view, India has to now build its future growth centered and focused on healthcare sector, because we have the demographic advantage, we have the IT advantage, and a lot of health IT does get built on, basic IT. But health IT is a specialized field, right? It's also important to remember that we have one of the largest, fastest growing sectors in the economy is the medical tourism. It's a very small sector, and we are surrounded by a very large public health infrastructure, particularly in the north and the eastern part of the country, which is not very robust. So people have to, a great deal depend on private health infrastructure for their needs, right? Which is not a bad thing necessarily. But, public and private have two very clear roles when it comes to healthcare, because markets do break down in healthcare. When you're thinking of preventive health, when you're thinking of primary health, the margins in the market, the business is not that much. So you are unlikely to see many private healthcare providers rush into preventive and primary care. So they tend to do well in the secondary and the tertiary. So you have so many clinics, you have so many hospitals. And yet primary care is where, the first gatekeeping, so to say, in the population has to happen. So that entire space is the responsibility of the state. And I think, the COVID crisis, if anything, has laid bare open the variations across the country in terms of the health infrastructure and the health governance. A chief medical officer, I think, wields the same authority as a superintendent of police or a district commissioner in many of the states like Kerala, Karnataka, Goa. I mean, these are very empowered people. And yet when you come to UP and Bihar, I mean, no one knows the chief medical officer, right? And that just tells you that in those societies, those states, healthcare has been relegated to a side, a social center. So this is a wake-up call in that sense.
So if you look at globally, when it comes to Italy or New York and some of the other European countries, there are a lot of statistics that have come out in terms of how healthcare system there is crumbling. So much so that they have to take a call which life to save and which not. Especially like in Italy, letting people who are above 80 to let them die, for the lack of better words. But for some reason, I've not been seeing enough statistic like those coming from India, as much as news that I'm following. But we have known that health spending in India is poor as a ratio of its GDP. We are seeing that the primary healthcare, the rural health infrastructure has never been robust in our economy. And yet these statistics are not coming out. Is it because we've been able to contain it faster, or I don't know, they're not available in the public records? So what has been your reading on that?
So I think this is where this could be a perfect segue to start the presentation.
Sure.
I'll run you through some numbers and then it will become relatively clear how we want to pitch the story of the Indian COVID-19 situation. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So let's start with the first picture. Right? If you see here, this is telling you how does India compare with the big hotspot countries of the world? And hotspot, by the way, is defined as countries with more than 50,000 confirmed COVID cases. Now just look at it. I mean, compared to US and Spain, Italy, most European countries and the US and Brazil, India is very low. These are log stats, okay? So these are all logarithmic table, log scale. So the actual distance between OECD and the US market and the European market in India is very large. Okay, India is 23,000, right? In the US, you're talking almost 900,000. I mean, it's a multiple magnitude in huge proportions. So that's the way the confirmed cases stand. What about the deaths? Well, deaths also look very similar, right? India, we have 721 deaths as of last night. The US is close to 50,000, right? And of course, you have Italy, 25,500. These are very big numbers. UK is, very close to 19,000. France is about almost 22,000. It's a very, very big numbers. Belgium, for a small nation, it's 6,500. Right? So it's a very large number of deaths that you're seeing in these markets. So this is what the Indian situation looks like, Vrinda. It's important to realize that nothing is static. When the cases began to come, no one is a mute spectator. The government is not a mute spectator. Businesses are not mute spectators, meaning community and the way things are organized. And households and individuals are definitely not mute spectators. So in the beginning, we were growing at a certain rate. But what happened is quite proactively, much before most nations, India banned travel from China. We airlifted students and kept them in separate quarantine camps, right? Isolation camps. Because of which their instant mingling, you see, unlike in the US, where even when travel ban happened, before that, people were coming in and they were mingling with the rest of the population. So there was a great degree of spread or contagion, which had already spread even before the administration brought in a travel ban. Along with that, most states of the country in India also enacted what is called the Epidemics and the Disease Act, which basically means, look, there is a contagion, there's a disease, an outspread, because of which we are required to give the state extra powers, right? Because you not only harm yourself by going out, but you're also a potential threat to others because the infection rate is so high in this case. So state is empowered with extra powers to curtail you, to quarantine you, to isolate you. Those are some very important measures. So because of the travel ban, schools and colleges were shut down. And the stringent quarantine acts, all of this happened very early on. Because of that, you saw that the initial growth that we saw, which was doubling every 3 days, that was really brought down to doubling 5 days and 6 days. So it started to go down. And that's when around the 29th of March, we discovered the big congregation that happened in Nizamuddin, the Tablighi Jamaat. And very quickly, we realized that it was a very large congregation, which had members and visitors who had come from many states of the country, 15, 16 states of the country. Now, that is exactly what contact tracing is. So a large part of containing this disease is to identify who are susceptible, who are likely positive, and whom have they come in contact with. So it's an extremely scientific, thorough process which needs to be carried out. Right? Isolation and all happens after that, but the contact tracing is a very important task. And I think this is where districts have to realize, states have to realize that there's a very large role for the local police to play, right? And you can see this in the case study that we have released recently on the Kasaragod initiative, where, debriefing, police are naturally trained to debrief and find out where all have you been, they do call tracing, do a lot of, background activity, which they are technically trained to do in large scale. The public health personnel, first of all, aren't that many in number one. Secondly, they're not trained at this scale to do these kind of surveillance and contact tracing. And the civil administration is also limited in terms of personnel. So I think it's very important for local administration of different places to learn from the successful cases that we've had in our own country, right? I mean, on the whole, of course, things are growing at a better rate now, but things are still growing. But we have successful districts where this has been curtailed, and there are lessons to be drawn from that. When the Tablighi Jamaat congregation was discovered, through the contact tracing, we began to see numbers doubling very rapidly. So then we went back to 3 days, actually. Right after initial gains, because of all the bans and the quarantines, we lost a lot of that gain because you began to see that the contagion had in fact spread geographically and in terms of numbers to many, many people. But then you had the the big lockdown. Of course, the Janta curfew for a day, and after that, the big lockdown was announced. And despite what we saw in terms of coordination failure, messaging failure, migrant labor, reverse migration, etc. On the whole, this is a very drastic, big step taken by any nation, right? And that naturally meant that this was a way to just pull this spread down. And you are seeing the impact of it 2 weeks from then. So from the 6th of April, you begin to see the increase happening at a decreasing rate. And the rate, meaning the speed of growth, started to decline quite continuously. Okay, very consistently it started to decline. And now, of course, at 23,000 cases, our active cases are doubling every 14 days. And that's very good news. Of course, it means we still have to continue what we are doing. And in places which are outbreak, the contact tracing and isolation has to be ramped up considerably, particularly in places like Bombay, where the numbers are growing. But one thing that you will note in this graph is very clearly that the nature of the virus is the incubation period is about 2 weeks. And you are seeing in this case that big policies that have been enacted do indeed show up in terms of total cases 2 weeks from when they were announced. That's why you see this sort of a disjoint, a break and a discrete jump in terms of the growth of numbers. These are graphs which are basically telling you, instead of looking at day-to-day fluctuations, let's look at long-term numbers. And the long-term trend is one where, while we are still growing in absolute numbers, the rate has been declining, right? If you look at the death rate, this is the panel on the right, the death rate is really beginning to stabilize. And those are good things. Those are all good things. This is the question you asked earlier, Vrinda. Unlike Italy, how come we're not seeing so many people dying or positive active cases? Well, our death rates are very low. And while one criticism has been, and I'll talk of testing in a minute, that we are testing too few, or we were testing too few, you can't hide death numbers, right? And we are noticing that over time, of course, the mortality rate, which is number of people who have died of COVID per million population, because these are countries with different population sizes, so you want to normalize it to some extent. India's mortality rate still remains very low. Okay, we are 0.53 per million population, so that's a very low mortality rate. You're seeing in countries like Japan, where they had a lot of initial success, and the mortality rate, though on the whole still remains low, but it is growing. And that's why you have seen that Japan, after the first month of seeming success, they've declared a national emergency. Right? That's the nature of this virus, that there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of the way it, the outcomes are felt. Now, if you look at Belgium has very high mortality rate, 568 people per million are dying, and it's still growing. So that's a very alarming number. Spain and Italy, since you spoke about Italy, look at the numbers. The mortality numbers are above 400 per million, but they seem to have stabilized, meaning they aren't growing anymore. While, if you look at the UK, if you look at US, you look at Sweden, these are countries where, though they have high mortality rate, they're still growing. So those are a real cause of concern globally in terms of the way this pandemic is playing out. This is to tell you that while we track total confirmed cases, and people get very scared when, the total confirmed cases are rising, but this also means, well, because it's a sum of active cases, recovered cases, and deaths that have happened due to COVID. It's really a total. And here, the countries which have so-called flattened the curve, the total confirmed cases flatten, but the active cases are what are really building up, right? So when active cases are growing, recovery becomes very strong. And that's when the total remains the same, constant, but recovery looks very robust. And that's where you have to look at Germany, South Korea, Iran, These are countries which have truly bent the curve because their number of recovered patients are majority, right? Number of active cases are now very, very little. So most people have recovered. Now, there could be a second wave. The antibody tests are showing that people still have strains, etc. Now, there are many uncertainties that we don't have answers to, but let's see things the way they are. If you begin to look at China, of course, it looks like somebody in China one day decided that they wanted to have a growth rate of a certain amount, and they have truly fitted the normal distribution. And about a week back, they recounted their dead. So now their mortality rate, if you recall, the last is 3.34, and it is not going to change. Okay, so that's China. But look at France, look at Italy, look at Spain, democracies with free press, and there is a great deal of testing. But you see, the recovery is quite uncertain with them. It's not like, one fine day they reach the peak and then everything started to look better. No. Active cases are still very significant. The recovery is there, it's growing, but it's uncertain, right? It's not growing at a rate at which you see, for instance, in China, or South Korea, or Germany. So these are large countries still struggling to manage the problem because active cases are still large in number. If you look at UK, UK seems to have a very large number of deaths. In fact, their recovery numbers are insignificant. They're very small compared to the overall caseload and the number of deaths. So that's truly troubling as well. Brazil has some data issues because they're fluctuating a great deal, and therefore you can't really read very much into it. But India, US, Turkey, large countries, the problem is still growing. So we are all watching and daily looking at the stats. But this is of interest to people in India. For us, there is a national story which we are seeing unfold. But the real story is unfolding in some pockets of the country. It's not a national uniform phenomenon, right? If you see, the all India trends here, 20,000 plus, are largely driven, if you look at the curvature of the moving average. Moving average because, you don't want to look at day-to-day fluctuations. You want to look at a smoother trend. Maharashtra is adding a very large number of people and it is still growing. So Maharashtra is a cause of concern, and Bombay and Pune happen to be the two hotspots in Maharashtra. So again, we have to localize and talk about how do we contain the spread in these places. Gujarat, again, it's added a great number of people. Lately, it has started to see a decline, but unless the decline survives and it is sustained over a long enough period of time, it's still an uncertain period for them. Delhi, after an initial jump, has brought things under control, but still quite uncertain if you think that they're adding on an average about 80, 90 people per day. Okay, so that's quite a bit. Rajasthan is increasing. Tamil Nadu, right from the beginning, it has maintained a high increase. So unlike most places where you've had a peak and then they've had a recovery, Tamil Nadu has had a plateau. So they have been adding sort of large number of people every day. So that is a cause of concern as well. UP has started to see an increase. Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, they're like twin states in many statistics, most sectors. And the disease outbreak here, they followed very similar trajectory in the beginning. But of late, in the last week or so, we are beginning to see a divergence. All right, Andhra increasingly looking vulnerable because the growth is high, and Telangana seems to do better, right? They seem to have things under control. It's been falling for now, last several days. Kerala seems to have controlled things, lately a little bit of rise, but on the whole, it has really brought the curve down considerably. Karnataka, we don't talk much about Karnataka. Karnataka has done a very good job, barring some recent increase, and that's why these are long-term phenomena we have to keep watching, but they've done really well as well. West Bengal, troubling again because it's growing, it's accumulating. These are large population states. Jammu Kashmir, Punjab again has done a good job if you look at the change and lately the decline. Haryana, again, we don't talk enough about Haryana, and we should, because after an initial escalation, look at the way they brought down the growth rate. Bihar, still very early stage. I think they might have just started testing, maybe because Bihar really doesn't have too many international airports. Most of it must have been urban to rural, sort of the reverse migrants bringing these infections into Bihar. So Bihar perhaps started late, the testing also started late, but the numbers are rising and rising rapidly. So on the whole, small numbers, but rising fast. This is a large country, so we have to now try and narrow down the problem because we have to solve the problem. We have to narrow down our effort to the hotspots, all right? If you look at the death rate, pretty much like the international markets, Kerala again has stabilized its death rate very low. This is something we should be very proud of because they had initial several hotspots and they have really managed to keep mortality very low. In fact, we knew of cases when elderly people above the age of 80, 85 successfully recovered. And these are hallmark of what a good public health infrastructure can achieve in times of such health crisis. Haryana again has done very well. Haryana, of course, has good private and public health infrastructure. UP is still growing. West Bengal is growing. You can see at the bottom Maharashtra and Delhi. It's largely Mumbai, Pune, and Delhi. High death rate compared to all India. Remember, again, from the global perspective, this is very low. Remember, in Belgium, France, and all, more than 400, 500 people are per million they're dying. So these are very small numbers, but this is relative difference across the states. Now, if you consider the testing, because many people talk about not enough testing, and it's important here to look at, excuse me, 1 second, I need to do this. Okay, thank you. That's mothering for you. And I would have shown him, but he has ice cream all over his face. So, okay. People say we don't do enough testing. And by the way, there is nothing called enough testing. To test is to know. So the more we test, despite the accuracy of the test, we do know about the probability of cases being there in certain areas. So we have to continue testing more. And as you are seeing in India from the 27th of March, the total number of tests have gone up tremendously. Okay, that's great. In fact, from April 19th, this has grown up even further. So these are all good things. But overall, if you look at the number of confirmed cases per 100 tests, it has more or less stabilized around 4.4. Okay, that's telling you that in India, while we aren't really doing random testing, this should come down further. We have a fairly narrow and let's say conservative testing protocol. We are mostly testing for people who are likely to have this disease. So who have a higher probability.
Right.
People with symptoms, people who have traveled, people who have come in contact with positive cases through the contact tracing. So all folks who have higher probability of, and despite that, you see that the numbers are actually quite low, right? So there's reason to believe that, and this is good reason, that in fact the infection spread, the infection rate in India is far more manageable. Now these numbers, by the way, for the US, it's about 17%. Italy was more than 20%, right? So those are places where the infection had spread a great deal. So in India, it looks like, it's fairly curtailed. This is to just tell you that, look, we have very little data, okay? All these pictures have shown you my understanding of the pandemic is thanks to the data that is being put together by ECDC, Johns Hopkins mainly, the WHO. And you can see that, these different data sets also have tremendous discrepancy. Okay, this is not a pure science that we are dealing with here. This is applied, statistics. This is, applied economics. We are really, or stats, really, we're really trying to fit and understand what is the nature of the growth. It is very much dependent on the data that you're going to use. Okay, and at this point, it's important to realize that we need very strong data. We need to invest in data in this country. We have to build data systems at highly disaggregated place. Right now, we should have, data centers in every district, which is feeding in real-time information on not just the cases, the active, the disease, the recovery, but also, and the testing, but also what is the nature of the contact tracing, right? What is the quarantine like? What are the guidelines? What are the rules that different district administration are following to maintain the protocols, the quarantine, etc. So a lot of this information, unfortunately, is not available. And that's a pity. It's a real pity. Now, based on the different data that you use, your growth rate also looks very different. Okay? It's a very important point, not appreciated enough, that if you use the ECDC data, then your cases are doubling 9 days. If you use the Johns Hopkins data, your cases are doubling 10 days. If you use WHO data, it's 9 days. You see the difference? And of course, what I have been reporting are the active cases, right? So as of the Johns Hopkins, the latest doubling of active cases as of today, happening every 14 days. But I have consistently used Johns Hopkins right from the beginning for many reasons. Now let's move to the economy part of it. So the data is telling us very clearly that the health epidemic is under control in India, okay? Not just in terms of overall number of cases, but also that these cases are not so severe, right? Our people are not dying in large numbers because of COVID, as you have seen in the European countries or as you are seeing in New York. So that's one thing that we have to accept and acknowledge, that the severity of the infection and the scale of the infection is not as it is in the other countries that we typically tend to compare ourselves with. So I think that's one thing important to realize. Having said that, it's also important to realize that these countries we compare ourselves with, the OECD countries, are very rich nations. We are a resource poor country. We are a low middle income country with an average annual income of under $2,100 a year per capita. So we are truly, a nation. We need to continue building wealth. We need to continue our growth. Not having the economy open up, not doing economic activities is bearing huge costs, and which in the common parlance in media people put this as a debate between a trade-off between lives and livelihood, but that's quite simplistic, right? Because it's not just lives and livelihood. Because of the lockdown and the different restrictions that we have, which were very required, we also don't have access to regular healthcare. So there is something called all-cause mortality, right? Diabetic patients who need regular care, people with respiratory ailments of other kinds. You'll have heart patients, you'll have cancer patients who need regular recovery. Now, again, for a resource-poor country like ours, particularly in the healthcare sector, because of the COVID the lockdown, a lot of all-cause mortality, other reasons why people die and have morbidities, meaning ailments, is also on the rise, right? We are concerned because we need to go back to life as normal, right? So lockdown is very costly for us, unlike it is for the OECD markets, where they have a lot of alternate institutions which can fill a lot of these gaps, right?
Sorry for interrupting, but a small question there. So can we say that in India, we are not hearing statistics around the lack of ventilators or masks, and not dire statistics, as we say, mainly because we have contained the disease much earlier because of the lockdown and helped to reduce that trace contacting, or, it's happening after 5 days or 14 days, which is way better a statistic when you compare it to developed countries. And that's why we have not reached the peak of our healthcare infrastructure, where you can see it crumbling down or shambling the way it is in developed countries. But at the same time, one has to have a warning sign that you may have contained it right now, but you may not have a late mover advantage in the future. And it's so essential that take this pandemic as a warning sign, and the government ramp up its primary healthcare system and really invest and build a way robust system, because now future is uncertain. There may be more pandemics like this.
Also, the current pandemic, we don't know how it will pan out. In fact, the latest data seems to suggest over the last few days, the ones at least we have been analyzing, that the US might very well see a second wave. Right? Yeah. We are seeing that after seeming success of several weeks in a small nation and a highly regimented nation with resources, tremendous resources like Singapore, actually went back to a national lockdown after many weeks. So this is a very uncertain virus, right? We understand little bit about it. In order to understand the severity and what exactly does the infection do. So when you speak about ventilators, for instance, you see, everybody is citing that JAMA study, which says that 80% of patients will not need anything. For them, it's just normal flu and they'll recover. But that other 20%, which are 15 normal hospitalization, 5% they will need ventilators, etc. Even that is not based on Indian data. Okay, and that is where I'm telling you that we can't just lift parameters and understanding of what this problem is doing in other nations and try and extrapolate for ourselves. It just doesn't make sense. So we need patient level data to understand by India, how severe is it?
Right.
How many of our patients, is it 20% that are requiring hospitalization? You see?
And that data is lacking right now in the public.
That we have no patient level data. And that truly I feel blindfolded in that sense, right? And I'm one who is always wary of picking up parameters from OECD or other markets and saying India mein aisa hoga. Because if you remember the initial predictions of the EPI models that 600 million people were going to get infected in India, highly alarmist numbers, they were all based on exactly this strategy that you're lifting parameters from other populations, other areas, and you're trying to project for India. So that's one, right? Lack of data is one problem. But the second is, indeed, we are not seeing huge hospital rush. Right? If we look at hospital level data, which we have done, then we are seeing that, this year, in terms of acute respiratory disorder, people coming with, acute respiratory problems because COVID has similar symptoms. This year looks very similar to last year and the year before that. March, April, May, this is that. So, it's not one-off. It is true that in India, people are not, the mortality rates are indeed, they seem to be very low, not just statistically, but also really when you're going out and seeing hospital level data, etc., they seem to be very consistent. Yes, the policies worked, lockdown was important, all of those things are there. It could also be just humidity, temperature, BCG, innate immunity. There are many hypotheses out there.
Right.
A lot of those are not tested because this is a real-time problem. The research that is coming out is not really peer-reviewed, that has not been subjected to the kind of rigor that is required to say that it is BCG which is, saving our souls today. But without getting into the causal sort of reasoning for why the incidence and mortality is low here, clearly the rate of growth seems to have been curtailed because of the government measures. So those things were important. But now there is also, the opportunity cost of a lockdown economically is very high. So it's important to realize that given the health situation is not so bad, we seem to be on top of it. Can we now try and find ways in which we can go back to creating wealth in whatever small ways?
So looking at your slide, I'll just put it in the question because if I'm not wrong, maybe we can, since you have livelihood statistics out there, so there is a statistic that has been worrisome for India before the crisis started, now more so, and that is unemployment levels. And it is something that is a cause for concern after the crisis. Joblessness. Will I get a job? I have lost my job. What shall I do? There are people who are going back to their villages. And if we see the agriculture statistic, it's a bumper crop and people are, with the demand shortage, you have a strain on rural economy, and with reverse migration, you have more mouths to feed than earning. So, from an unemployment perspective, the strain on the rural economy, there is clearly something out there which needs to be discussed in how can we get out of it? Is there a positive stray of light there?
Well, joblessness is perhaps, can you still see the slide? Or we are?
No, I cannot.
Okay. Okay. So basically, there were a few things there. Basically, it's important to understand right now, the labor force participation itself has declined. People don't want to work right now. That's why we're all scared and we're going home. We're going back to the villages. That's technically not employment. Employment is when someone is looking for a job and you're unemployed when you don't find the job. Right now, people are going back home. And therefore, the unemployment numbers are going to shoot up. The labor force participation has really plummeted. But the point is, when we remove the lockdown, will people come back? No, because first of all, the fear is still very much there. That's why public policy is about dispelling that fear, about saying, look, we will bring you back in batches. We will bring you back to the shop floor. We are guaranteeing you job of a certain kind for a certain number of days. Right? And that's why you will see in the rural areas, the take-up of NREGA will go up. In fact, the first announcement with the FM made, I think on the second or the third day of the lockdown was on the soft landing, right? So NREGA was one part of it, the PDS distribution PM Kisan was front loaded. SHGs were to get extra sort of credit. All of this has really got to do with the bottom quintile. Let's say the bottom 2 quintile, because all said and done, we are in a recession. The attempt should be to prevent a depression, but poverty will increase. Right? Poverty will increase simply because there is such a large number of households or people around the poverty line that with a shock like that, they will fall. That's where state policy, fiscal policy matters, that you have to provide them with the means so that you don't have starvation debt. And that's why PDS becomes important and the cash transfers become important. But then there is the rest of if you see the next 2 quintiles, which basically employs, works in MSMEs, or they have their own small enterprises. And they are, for them to remain shut for a very long period of time is not sustainable, right? Either they're self-employed or even if they're hiring others, it's not possible for small businesses or even medium businesses to really, or lately even large businesses, because, the balance sheets have been so fragile, to really make payroll payments for months, right? They can't do that. That's where I think the fiscal policies need to come in terms of very targeted objective of not seeing bankruptcies, not seeing businesses shut down. Right? So there is great vulnerability, economic vulnerability in the system, which needs to be circumvented in economic policies, which is a combination of the monetary policy. So you have the moratoriums, you're trying to get NBFCs and banks to lend more to these sectors, the MSMEs particularly, because they employ such a large number of people, but also fiscal policy, and fiscal policy that doesn't just cater to the poorest in the society, but that is also catering to the self-employed and the middle class. Because the middle class also in India is not that rich. Right. So I think this is a time, and I suspect in the next few days, we will see next slew of announcements from the finance ministry on these.
So circling back to finance, you mentioned the word small landing, and I actually want to point out, right now I'm talking from an individual perspective, and then I would like to talk from the firm perspective, small businesses as well, is you wrote a paper, an article I saw in 2015 on advancing financial inclusion in India beyond the Jan Dhan Yojana. And there I found some interesting points where you mentioned about designing financial instruments, be innovative, where you can actually create savings for the poorer section of the society, which I think can be said the same thing for the middle class as well, where there can be that soft landing in these times. They have some savings, some cash to fall back on. Because we are seeing these stories where there is zero balance account, but people are saying we haven't received money. They have been covered in the media extensively. So if you could tell something about those instruments, what in the financial sector we can actually do to help that soft landing, to actually prepare for that rainy day for a poor section of the society.
So I think, Brinda, first of all, when we say there needs to be a war room, but that war room at the apex level is not just on the health side of the story. It also means maybe we should have a designated minister and a team which is only going to look at food distribution, which reports on a daily basis how much food grain has been distributed in which districts. Right? I think that real-time feedback, because we have the announcements, and this is where I think government capacity begins to make a difference. Again, remember, you can have policies at the central level. A lot of the administration and the implementation will happen not just at the state, it will happen at local administration. So that's a third tier in the democracy. So you're talking about panchayats, urban local bodies, right, which have the capacity to carry out the kind of things we're talking about. So that's one. The financial system, it's important to remember that financial system in India has been fragile for some time, right? We've had liquidity problem even before the crisis. The banking system is, weak right now. So a lot of effort is being made to handle the NPAs, to really, put in, a lot more money into the public sector banks in order to really, the entire, sort of joining consolidation of the banks that we saw happen last year. So they are themselves in a lot of flux. So there's a lot of risk aversion. they're unlikely to start lending, because now the RBI is saying lend to these, because the innate risk aversion means that transmission is not going to happen from the announcement to the final disbursal of credit. And I think that's where the innovation in terms of differentiated financial institutions, having specific goals for specific institutions. You see, right now we are thinking that the tide will lift and it will raise all boats.
Right.
I don't think that's going to happen because of the innate structural weaknesses in the system. Everyone is really holding on to their cash because they're themselves not looking very strong. So I think this is where policy will have to really do much more segmented sort of clear objective setting. So NBFCs of a certain kind need to do this. What you're talking about, people say, and one sense is that precautionary savings might go up after COVID.
Yeah.
Because, who knows, right? Until a vaccine arrives, and even a vaccine arrival doesn't mean we will all get a shot tomorrow. Right. From the vaccine to the mass production to the vaccination process, it will take years and years. So households are going to hold on to their saving. And that means we should have not only institutions, but design instruments so that people have faith and they are able, to put their money into those good instruments which are suitable for them. That's what I meant.
So I'll just give a brief summary for our audiences. So as far as Indian economy is concerned, we've discussed in today's discussion unemployment, health, education, and financial institution. And now I want to take this. Actually, I had just one question in the segment of finances about universal basic income. What do you think? Is this the right time to have it? Also with the, I'm going to adding oil also here, that how it will reduce that pressure on fiscal deficit. And maybe government has the leeway to think about a policy for a universal basic income. Do you think anywhere we going in that direction? Is it a recommended policy?
Well, Brinda, so I'd written this article in Foreign Affairs a few years back. UBI is simple, and so it is desirable. India already has one form of UBI. PM Kisan is a UBI, number one. But it's not universal. We'll never have a universal basic income simply because cutting a check of 1,200 rupees per month or something, that makes no sense for the rich corporations of the country. We also have the largest number of billionaires, for instance, right? So, politically, it makes no sense to have uniform, sort of universal basic income. What we are talking about is targeted or a DBT, right? A direct benefit transfer, which is really cash transfer in a targeted fashion. So PM Kisan does exactly this. But my point is now we have to expand this. Construction workers are a very large part of migrant workers, large informal workers, and I think that the benefit has to be extended to those vulnerable segments of the society beyond farmers. Think of fishermen, right? So there are many such occupation groups, which I think do fall within the larger category, particularly given this crisis, of deserving a direct benefit transfer. And I think it's a good idea if we club them all together and think of, and frankly, the first announcement that Nirmala Sitharaman made in the first package, which was 0.8% of the GDP, construction workers were a large part of that. So we don't call it UBI, Vrinda, but we have UBI in different hues and shades already existing here.
Perfect. So now I'll move to what after the crisis. That a short talk around that, a bit of future projection there. So first thing is, I want to talk about, I want to bring in oil here because it's been quite a talk of the town in the international market, and India being the biggest importer, it is clearly India is on a gaining side in this whole oil pricing and trade and price war. So do you think that how should I a holy grail has come to India in the disguise of the falling oil prices, and it is an opportunity where the rate of rejuvenation of this of the economy can be faster, because or it'll become cheaper for people to buy, to put petrol in their cars, for transportation companies, which is a lifeline for any economies working, transport, getting goods from one place to another. So where do you see India panning out in that direction from an oil perspective?
No, oil is a boon for us. And I suspect, most commodities markets will show a decline. Okay. But I think that is where, for a country like ours, which still needs to buy these fundamental inputs, this is a time to build big time, right? Let's use these sort of savings to really pump in more capex. I'll tell you, the future growth over the next several years, I suspect, will be on the back of government spending.
Okay.
Our private investments have been declining since 2012 on account of many policies, right, including Supreme Court rulings, etc., etc. Because of all of that, private investment has been declining, and now with this current situation, I suspect anyone who's making a projection of India's future GDP over the next several quarters and years are mostly going to do it on the back of government spending. Now the point is, government spending of what kind?
Right.
And obviously that's where the quality of the government investment, the government spending will matter. And so we have to be smart about it and put it into capex, capital expenditure. And again, we need a lot more roads. Connectivity has to be improved, but we need a lot of healthcare too. We need to spend on healthcare. And that's why I think pivoting to the future, as you just did, and as I mentioned in the beginning, with the aging world population, demand for healthcare going up globally, India has to build the healthcare sector as the future engine of growth. It truly has the potential. Now, of course, we are shipping away the smartest doctors and nurses, etc. Let's now just train so many more that while we ship many also decide to stay back. You need to pay people, you need to give them benefits. In the rural areas, it's not just the money. Doctors will need safety, doctors will need all kinds of amenities. Construction, when I say build, healthcare is not construction. In fact, if you look at many parts of UP and Rajasthan, etc., lately in the last 5-6 years, a lot of community health centers have come up. But those are physical infrastructure. That was easy to do. What is very difficult is to get the doctors and the nurses and the attendants to actually move to those remote areas.
Right.
But that is where the policy innovation, that's where money is needed. So we have to start spending on training people, building a cadre of health IT people, which are very specialized IT people, right, in healthcare. And then, of course, spend a great deal on R&D. I mean, right now, why are we using Johns Hopkins data? We should have data centers for healthcare, and not just healthcare. I mean, these are intelligence units at the district level throughout the country, right? It enhances the overall productivity of the economy. But I think the future of India, I think, should be the vision for me, at least, is in terms of healthcare-centered investment growth, right? Investment planning.
So that was fair point, pretty valid. And I want to move here to, at a global level, we see that most of the countries, industries have their supply chain somehow linked to China in some way or the other. And with the Chinese economy also shutting down, there has been a huge disruption in the supply chain. And I don't know, do you think India has an opportunity here to get that foreign investment, foreign linkages to India, because it is a resource-rich country, to create that supply chain from India and have that opportunity for the Indian businesses? And a policy in that direction, how can it go a long way in improving the GDP of the country, the per capita? So what, in the global world order, do you think we have an opportunity here where we can actually become the business leaders and take that mantle away from China?
I think every country is looking to decouple with China, right? And yet, because the global dependence, most countries have great dependence on China as far as inputs. In many cases, even particularly Europe and the US, products, a lot of products are coming from there. And I think this is where one of my favorite quotes when I was in London a few years back was when I heard that, look, every country must have a strategy for China, because China has a strategy for every country. Right? China knows exactly how the whole thing is very well planned. They're very tough competitors. So remember that it's not just going to take the usual set of policies for us to try and lay out the red carpet and businesses will come, because China will up their ante. I think it's important to realize the Chinese dependence from two perspectives. One is, strategically, it's important for us to be self-reliant in certain sectors, right? And pharmaceutical happens, obviously, it has shown us that because we depend so much on the APIs, many chemicals, etc., that come from China. Right now, our status as pharmacy to the world is also threatened because we depend so much on the APIs, right? I think self-reliance in certain sectors is very important. So there is that degree of strategic thinking that is required from the economy perspective. The second is, many countries, including Japan, many European countries, US, they're looking to relocate these large manufacturing plants away from China. The second is, China is aging. So the labor costs in any case have, they've been rising for some time. So it's almost like the stars are aligning, and it will take India a lot of strategic thinking and not just cutting corporate tax. Yes, that was a very good move. Yet we have seen that Vietnam, Philippines, Bangladesh have gained a lot of these sort of out movements from China are going to these places, because I think those are countries which have improved their ease of doing business climate considerably, cutting down the red tape, right? The compliances. We have to do those things beyond the tax rates, making them competitive. We really have to make it easy for businesses to come to India. And I think we will now, because the window of opportunity is too open, and it's too obvious right now to not do it, especially when faced with large unemployment concerns, because nothing gives jobs at the scale at which manufacturing does. So it's important from that perspective as well.
So I hope India won't miss this opportunity. I have a small question on education. I think we have talked in bits with terms of training, but we haven't delved deep into it. So now, education sector in India, yes, there have been problems. There have been dropout rates. We've talked about we have good tertiary education in terms of IITs, IIMs, but our primary and secondary are suffering, especially at the village level. But now that weakness has come more into the light because of how everybody is moving to distant learning. Now my niece and nephews can afford a laptop and a Wi-Fi. And they're also facing problems because each family has maybe one laptop. Now they have to have four if there are 4 kids in the house. And yes, you're borrowing from other family members, and it's quite a task. But imagine the people who don't even have access, who are living in with no Wi-Fi connection, the amount of education that is suffering at that level. So where do you think the economy can work in that direction? More internet penetration with Jio, Facebook deal coming to the picture? How do you think our future is looking in terms of education?
So Vrinda, very important for us to not forget that technology is not a panacea. Technology is a great enabler. So look, we are talking while, I don't know when we'll get a chance to meet. We are talking to many people remotely. I do a lot of classes, even before COVID. For instance, we did several MOOCs. We do distance learning. A lot of those things have been experimented with quite successfully in the higher education, particularly in the university or the postgraduate level. They're cost effective in many of the big universities globally and in India. So we've been doing a good job of that. But technology is not a substitute in any way at the school level. At the school level, it's not just knowledge, right? You will still need the brick and mortar form of education. You will need the hand, sort of the touch effect. You will need the teachers, the teacher-student ratio. Those kind of things will matter a great deal. So then we're talking about the quality of education, and that technology is an enabler. It's a complementary input, maybe increasingly becoming more and more important, because now we have what is called the 21st century, learning goals and learning tools, etc. But teachers will remain important for a very long period of time. Okay, I don't think they're going away anywhere, thank God. But I think the quality of education in India fundamentally has to do with the fact that first, that traditionally teachers have not been upping their training themselves, right? So the quality, I mean, we were still taught, and I must say, including me, we were taught old notes from 60s and 70s that have been. So upgrading the curriculum itself, making it more scientific, making it more modern, real time, because the kids have that information on the side. They already know what is obsolete, right? Because they have access to all this internet and information. But on the side, I think it's also an incentive problem. It's an incentive problem because I think teachers need, their incentive has to be compatible with the performance of the students. And that's where the governance of education system becomes very important. Right? And this happens all the way to the higher education. But in higher education, it's a little more tractable. There, it's more a research problem and sort of building the right environment and putting in money. In the primary and sort of the K-12, money is not necessarily the constraint. Because of RTE, most of the kids are in the classroom. Improving the quality of the teacher has to do a little bit with money, but a lot of it has to do with incentive and the governance structure, the way things are organized in the school level, that they actually upgrade and they're able to bring it into the classroom. Now, against this backdrop, think of greater automation. What you're learning today, I mean, kids, I don't know why they're still learning, the tables, the math tables. And yet, they're all learning. My own kids, they're all going to, school, both of them. And there's a lot of rote learning. And I think rote learning also builds certain parts of your brain, the plasticity, etc. But those skills, the calculator will do that so easily. Your watch will do that. Your phone will do that. Now, your day-to-day life, you have so many gadgets. A lot of those skills are not going to be rewarded the way they were rewarded earlier. So kids will have to therefore be trained in creativity, in arts, humanities, and science the way science ought to be taught, which is great curiosity and mixing of very different subjects. That requires innovation and trial and error of a very different kind. Right. It's not technology which I see as a problem or a great enabler. I really think the organization of education system has to really become more modernized.
So, Dr. Ravi, these were some of the questions from my side. And before ending, would you like to add anything that I have maybe not asked you enough, or you would like to add in certain direction, a certain topic?
No, I've greatly enjoyed it. It was excellent conversation. I think we covered a whole range of topics with that. So thank you very much for your topics. I had a very good time.
Thank you so much. Stay safe, and I hope your family stays safe in such times.
You guys, take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.